Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas. Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. Hey everybody, welcome back to Bluegrass Jam Along. My guest on the podcast today is Bob Minner, and this is one of the episodes in the series where I pick a guest who's been on the podcast before and invite them back to chat about a particular record. And I'm delighted to say that Bob chose Norman Blake's Whiskey Before Breakfast record. Anybody who's listened to the podcast over the past few years and has heard Bob talk about Norman knows what a huge fan he is and what a depth of knowledge and admiration he has for Norman and his music. So it's a real delight to talk to him about this record. Such a cool record and such an inspiration to so many people. Not only will we chat about the record, Bob also phoned Norman before this interview and asked him a few questions about where some of the material had come from, which that's extraordinary to get to have that level of insight as well. So it's whether you know this record inside out or it's the first you're hearing of it, you're going to learn something from this, I think. I hope so. I certainly did. It's always a joy chatting to Bob. And like often, as is the case with people I've interviewed before, we just sort of start chatting and the interview develops out of just saying hello to each other. And that was the case in this instance. So there's no sort of immediate intro or anything like that. We just started chatting about like that era of music when this came out in the 70s and how people found music and how that was different from now. So yeah, indulge us in a little bit of a ramble about that because I think it's really interesting context for this music and for the conversation. And I also just really enjoyed it. Chatting to Bob is an absolute treat. In the conversation, we mention a video that Bob did, and it's with Bryan Sutton, Chris Eldridge, and Kenny Smith, and they were playing the guitar that is featured on the cover of Whiskey Before Breakfast. Not the one that is played on it, but the one that Norman held on the cover. And they chat about the record and they play some songs from it, and that's a great watch. I've put a link in the show notes. Go and watch that. That's fantastic. It's a lot of fun. And do go and check out and buy Bob Minner's Norman Blake tribute record as well, because that is really cool. But that's it. I'm going to let you hear our conversation. This is Bob Minner celebrating Norman Blake's Whiskey Before Breakfast.
You know, just the process of finding out there was new music was in its way kind of a hit and miss thing, you know. I guess you could say it was really kind of community based with the bluegrass festivals. You'd go to a festival, you'd see your friends, and they'd say, "Hey, so and so has got a new," or "Have you heard?" Blah blah blah, and you kind of make a mental note of that, and then go to the record table. Maybe they'll have it, maybe they won't, and then when you get home, you know, you search that out. So it was kind of an adventure. It wasn't so instant, you know. And I think also to the financial commitment, you know, to buy a record or a cassette or a DVD, you know, whatever you were going to purchase, it was like, you know, you're actually spending, it's not a subscription base, you know, and you're buying a record for whatever that cost. And, you know, so you're investing in a physical product, which, you know, I have a subscription to Apple Music. Yeah, I mean, you know, and it's the same thing I complain about because songwriters don't really get paid what we should get paid, you know, and nobody buys full records anymore, you know. Nancy Blake at one point had gotten I got this conversation recorded with her, and she's talking about that very thing, like her solo record, how we tend to chop up the listening experience into smaller sections when really that's never the intent of anything they did. They wanted you to listen because the whole record was saying something, you know. So the financial, you know, paying for the record, then of course as you get older you learn that, man, that really helps the artist, you know. It's a physical product. So, and that's kind of how it came about, you know, this thing, you know. This is the original copy, which I love because it's got Norman Blake's guitar album sticker on the vinyl, and so that's kind of, and I came to that record because I had worked enough shows as a young guy. I was about 12 or so, and I had enough money for a cheap Bentley acoustic guitar, um, and some records. And that was one of the records. I forget the second record. I had like two or three records, but, and I guess I found out, I guess I recognized Norman from maybe the one picture on the Circle Being Broken album that my dad had, or had heard about him, somehow, some way, maybe through Pickin' magazine or Fret's magazine. But hey, if you're going to buy a guitar at a record store, you have to have a record that says Norman Blake's guitar album because they probably go hand in hand. So that's how I came upon that record.
Yeah, and it's interesting talking about physical products and stuff because this is a record that has some fantastic liner notes on the sleeve that you just don't,
Hmm.
you wouldn't ever know if you just streamed it. I mean, it's not even on the streaming
Yeah.
services, I don't think. But
Yeah. Yeah. The liner notes themselves, you know, are kind of like, you know, Nancy, I'm reading them here. Um, yeah, she's just giving the rundown of what he's wearing, what kind of pick, what kind of guitar, what kind of strings, and
the actual, I
you
mean, you get
know.
the actual gauge of the strings that are on the guitar, you know.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. What are they here? Yeah, 60 on the bass, 44, 36, 24, 16, and 11. Okay,
That's
that's
some
odd.
specific liner notes right there.
You know, yeah, if you're looking for a combination for your home safe, use the use the string gauges off of this album. Yeah, nobody's going to guess those. Um, and there's always, and again, I mean, we're not on video on the podcast, but there's the famous, back picture of Norman, you know, in the
Mm.
backyard. This is when they lived on Belmont Avenue in Nashville, and that's the 30-60-18 that me and Critter and Sutton and Kenny Smith featured in that video. It's on YouTube. You can check that out. Um, and then, so it's a 30-60-18 on the cover, but he played a 34-D-18 bar fret on the record. And Norman says he don't remember where that guitar went. Who knows where that went? So uh, I think just also too the visualness of it. This guy sitting on a chair, looking very hippie-esque with this old guitar. It's like, okay, this guy is probably a pretty good guitar player. I'm going to buy the record, and get into it. And it kind of just really putting the needle down just kind of really changed my life, I have to say, and I'm not trying to be grandiose about that. Um, but my mom and dad, like a lot of people back in those days, had the big console stereo, which were like it's a piece of furniture, and it would mash the carpet down and leave the imprint, because it weighed a gazillion tons. And I remember putting that record on, and just from the first few notes of Hand Me Down My Walking Cane, Norman's tearing it up, Charlie Collins is playing rhythm, and it's just this different wall of tone that I really hadn't heard before. I'd heard guitars and stuff, but I hadn't heard that kind of playing and that veracity and just boldness and like, rawness may be another adjective to use. Yeah, so that kind of that started the change.
It's really interesting because even, as you said, like Charlie Collins plays on some of this record and the rest of it's just
Yeah,
Norman. But
yeah.
even the tracks where it's just Norman sounds like about three guitar players because it's all the cross picking and the intricacy of what he's doing.
Yeah, his whole thing has always been, we never hired a bass player because I am the bass player, and Nancy with the cello added that low end, but that was common that was common through the 1800s too. String bands had a lot of cellos sometimes. So, But Norman just had this ability to kind of check off all the boxes sonically. Um, and I think that's one of the things that kind of really made him unique within himself, And he had come from uh, the Johnny Cash show and doing sessions in Nashville, but he had had two other records before this record. Old what was it? Well, it had three. He had the Fields of well, the first one. What was the first one?
It's Home in
Okay,
Sulphur Springs, wasn't it?
yes, yeah, yeah. I should know that already. Oh, I'm trying to look at my notes too. Home in Sulphur Springs. And he said that they recorded that record at Glazer Sound Studios in Nashville. And the reason they recorded that at Glazer Sound Studios, it was recorded the week before Christmas in '71. And they recorded Steam Powered Aeroplane. They recorded back home in Sulphur Springs. They recorded Tut Taylor's album, and they recorded Brother Oswald's Dobro album. But Norman says the reason that that he recorded Home in Sulphur Springs there is because John Hartford, the Glazer brothers, owned the studio, but they also owned John Hartford's publishing, and most notably on Gentle on My Mind. So you could say that the money truck was kind of backed up to the Glazer building, And so he said we had the use of this really good studio. So it was a really good opportunity if you're going to make your first solo record, record it in a really good studio, which was, state of the art. Claude Hill did all the engineering. He's still alive. That's a guy you need to talk to also, the recording engineer for that. So Norman had gone through those, that one, Fields of November, Old and New. And then he gets to this with Rounder, And what's really kind of interesting is that Norman says that Whiskey Before Breakfast is not one of his favorite records that he's put out.
Wow.
Yeah, and he said, but Rounder, they wanted a guitar album, and it just hit. I think one of the reasons that it kind of hit, and he echoes this, it came out at a time where flat picking was, I wouldn't say a new thing, but it was kind of in its early heyday stages. You had Clarence, who had passed away by that time, but you had him. You had Doc. He was making a big splash and had been for quite some time before Norman. Um, and Tony is starting to come into his own. Dan Crary has certainly made his contributions. And then there's another record um, from Missouri, Twin Picking, with Dudley Murphy and Adam Granger. It's kind of an obscure record, uh, but that was really the very first. And Dudley's passed, but I was really good friends with Dudley. He was really another mentor with me. But he's from Missouri. He was an art teacher at Drury College in Missouri, but a great flat picker. And this record was like the very first like twin picking flat picking record where you got two guys trading off. Um, and so I think it was kind of a perfect storm within the guitar world for this record to kind of really make a big splash because, like I said, it's Norman Blake, and he's kind of just really kind of coming out into his own. He's broken away from the Hartford thing for the most part, and he's ready to kind of take that stand. And he's already got the other previous records, but this one, for some reason, I just really Rounder must have known what they were doing because they wanted a guitar record. Boy, they sure got one.
Well, and you think about like the mix of material on here, some originals, there's some of Norman's stuff. There's it's an amazing mix of material, from fiddle tunes through to like songs that there's things on here that I just consider classics now, aren't there?
Oh, yeah, that's the thing about it is that, you know, his interpretation of these songs, um, and Norman's kind of like real interesting with like where he gets material from. He's always just been so super consistent on finding material that he doesn't write that sounds like a Norman Blake song, you know. And
Yeah,
so, when you slip, it's like when you slip a Norman Blake song into these others, they all sound genuine. They all sound like they come from the same source. And one of the things that when I knew we were going to do this conversation, I called Norman up and I said, "Hey, if you got a few minutes, so I want to talk about the album." I told him about you. And I said, you know, I'd like to know, you know, where did you get these songs from?
right.
What was your inspiration to put this batch of songs together in this record? And so he was real generous and gave me a lot of information on, so as we go through these, we can go through them song by song, and I'll just kind of tell you what he told me about where he got the songs from.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, and what a start to the record, "Hand Me Down My Walking Cane." What an opening track.
It hits you pretty hard, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And if you listen to it, Norman's playing with the capo, Charlie's playing open, so he's getting that little bit of a lower bass register on Charlie Collins's rhythm. Um, and him and Charlie just seem to kind of really be really, really good friends. Um, Obviously, Charlie played guitar for Acuff for years
Hmm.
and hung out a lot at the Pick and Parlor in Nashville. And there's a funny story about Norman tells about Charlie Collins that Charlie Norman was at the Pick and Parlor playing, and somebody who had no idea who he was had come in and just stood by Charlie Collins, not really even knowing who Charlie Collins is. I said, "Who's that playing guitar?" And Charlie Collins goes, he says, "That's Norman Blake." He says, and then he told the guy, he says, "It sounds like honey dripping off a hot rock, doesn't it?" And I thought, yeah, that's a good way to explain it. So him and Norman were really kind of connected at the hip. And that song, "Hand Me Down My Walking Cane," um, Norman just said that was just a standard song that had been around forever. And he'd added verses to it. You can kind of make up your own verses. In Norman's words, any song that's instrumental or something like that, he says, "Well, that's how the song goes today. Might be different tomorrow,
Yeah,
you
I bet.
know." But "Hand Me Down My Walking Cane," man, I think that, like I said, for me, that's the first song that just kind of really hit me in the teeth with this huge dreadnought guitar sound. Like I said, I hadn't heard anything like that. Two guitars, but it sounds like 20. So yeah, that's a great. If you're going to start a record, not a bad choice. Me and Sutton tried to recreate it, and and Brian, as great as I think he would even say it. Compared to normal, we failed miserably, but respectfully. But respectfully, how you going to top it? you know. And then he gets into like Under the Double Eagle,
Hmm.
which is kind of a standard song. Norman told me, he said he got that song, he learned that from his grandmother originally. And his grandmother was like this really well trained piano player. And she was like really well versed in Sousa marches, John Philip Sousa. And so I guess he remembers hearing her play this on, on the piano. And it's, I mean, it's a popular song, obviously for guitar players, but yeah, he said he got that early on in his life from his grandma.
Yeah, it's an interesting choice, isn't it? It's I've heard that so many times, arranged for marching bands and brass bands, and it's I don't know if it's one of those that people still play. Is it kind of in the repertoire today?
Yeah. And, the thing for a guitar player is that it changes keys.
Yeah.
The second part, I mean, you typically play it in C. The second part is played as F as the one chord, you know, And so part of the part of the thing with most guitar players is like if you're playing that second part in F, and F is the one chord. If you go to the four chord, which would be the B flat, to play the melody, it's a little tricky, because it's just B flat. There's nothing open in B flat.
Mm.
And I haven't listened to any of the Sousa marches or any other like marching band with this, but I think what's interesting, and I could be totally wrong, but it's speculation. When Norman goes to that B flat, in order to give himself more of an open voice, he plays the E minor, the E seventh chord. So it goes from that B flat to the E7, which kind of gives him some open strings to work with, harkening back to kind of being his own bass player. So that's speculation, but if I was a guitar player, that's kind of what I would do. And maybe that goes along with the original piano or marching band versions. I don't know.
Yeah, and there's bits on this record that are just a masterclass in solo guitar playing on there. There's lots of amazing guitar players who still slightly fear playing solo. It's a different approach to being able to play a tune over somebody else. Like just play a tune on your own is a thing, isn't it? And this record has some of the best examples of that. We'll be right back with you just after this. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins. The Collings team will be bringing a sample of their finely crafted guitars to Bryan Sutton's Blue Ridge Guitar Camp on May 28th through June 1st. Attendees will have the chance to directly compare Collings' Standard Series, Traditional Series and Hill Country Series instruments to find their perfect fit amongst the Collings Dreadnought lineup. The incredible faculty includes Bryan Sutton, Julian Large, Jake Worman, Tim Stafford and more, and the event culminates with a guitar celebration concert on Sunday night, June 1st, with tickets available to the public. The concert features performances from the entire faculty, along with bluegrass legends Ricky Skaggs, Dan Tominski and Woody Platt. Find out more at blueridgeguitarcamp.com, and for those not attending, don't forget to follow Collings' Instagram and Facebook profiles that week for updates, photos and more.
Yeah, solo playing, I think for any guitar player is like, at least for myself, I always say it's like walking a tightrope over alligators. It's just like in any particular second, it can go south. Um, and it is a really unique particular skill. It really, really is. Um, and, Greer, I mean,
Mm.
take, in my opinion, I got the house to myself. That's another master class in solo guitar playing.
Mm.
And what makes that great, like if you're listening to like Bill Cheatham, it goes on forever. He takes a really long shot at it. But what's amazing is that he's reinventing, the A and B parts constantly through the whole thing. And yet you still know it's that song. It's not an easy feat. And Norman, it's the same thing. Uh, I think, I would be interested to hear how Tony approached Church Street Blues, you know, on how he felt about going solo to do that record. Um, you know, and so, but at least for Norman, I think this is what had always done. And, he had been around enough fiddle players, mandolin players, and even guitar players growing up that I don't think the solo thing was as scary to him as others. It's like he was just kind of cut out to do it, you
Mm.
know. Um, yeah, so um, and then I guess the next song, Salt River, I think, that's just Salt Creek is all that is, you know. And, I am pretty amazed at just like how Norman just pours on the heat on that song. I mean, really, really tears it up. Um, and I don't know. I mean, Salt. I think if you change the name of a song like that, since it was public domain, I think he get paid for it as a title, so that's a good business move on Norman's part.
Well, it's funny because you like talking about the speed and stuff, and there's a note in the liner notes. I've got them here somewhere, and it's Nancy saying, "I went out for Kentucky Fried Chicken coffee and told Norman when he was playing too fast." That was her role, to tell him when he was
Yeah,
playing
there
too
it
fast.
is. Yeah,
I love
yeah,
that. I
yeah,
love that.
yeah. And even back, I mean, she has a different musical sense. Nancy was, like I said, harkening back to our conversation about that. Nancy said when she got with Norman, she's used to memorizing and playing really long pieces of classical music. So 3 or 4 minutes to her was really nothing. You know, um, and so yeah, I find that interesting too. That she said he was playing too fast. You know, um, and maybe that's a reason Norman doesn't like this record as much as he likes the other stuff that he's done because maybe he just feels it was. I don't know. I'm just speculating. But Salt River's hard to keep up with. I
Yeah,
mean,
I mean,
even if you're a pretty good guitar player, that's a challenge. You know, and maybe I think too, as he progressed in his career, you don't really hear that fast, speedy stuff. You hear a more tempered, more defined musician, as you would expect to hear. I would think, you know. But Norman's young when he's doing this record, and so I guess maybe he just needed to blow one out. I don't know, you
and
know.
also just he's got such a great sort of old timey groove about the way he plays. Like the music dances, and on some of the later records, like hear Norman play a hornpipe or whatever, like New Century hornpipe or whatever, and there's such a sense of movement about those tunes. The next track up here is Old Grey Mare, which has got such a cool groove to it.
It does, and I'm going to hearken to what you said. I'm going to, reinforce this. Like, okay, so guitar players today, younger guitar players are learning from guitar players. Okay, so if you take somebody who is a okay flat picker and say they're 19 or 20 years old, and they'll say, oh, where are you learning from? Well, they might be taking, Brian or Critter's Artist Works course, or they're listening to other guitar players and learning. So they're guitar players that are learning fiddle tunes from guitar players. And it was not like that with Norman. Norman's learning his stuff from fiddle players who have a whole different approach. They have that dancing kind of element to their playing. You know, that's why I think they really loved having James Bryan in the band when it was the Rising Fawn String Ensemble because he brought that. He wasn't the fanciest fiddle player. He wasn't like a bluegrass, like, a hot bluegrass player, although I found out later he could do that. But he brought such um, a I guess to hearken what you said, a dancing sensibility to the fiddle tunes, and so I think Norman just grew up listening to fiddle players
Mhm.
and trying to bring that spirit. And I think that's what makes his playing kind of elusive, So I think I've got tons of fiddle records, especially coming from Missouri, which has a ton of great old fiddle players. They have a really big legacy in Missouri fiddle playing. Um, yeah, if you're going to learn to play guitar, I think like listen to fiddle players, get you some old time records and kind of absorb because there's a lot of nuance in there that really makes a difference in your playing. And I think Norman was one of the first people to really kind of, even if he didn't say it directly, you heard it. Maybe because you couldn't define it. That's what drew you to it.
Yeah, you get the same sense listening to someone like Russ Barenberg, and there's also the thing that comes from fiddle playing, maybe, which is to vary the melody rather than just go off on a tangent and do a whole solo that's based over the chords. But like, it's that just constant, like you were saying about Greer, constantly reinventing the melody.
Yeah. I think, melody. is kind of, I mean, I always grew up listening to older guys talk about melody, you know, and I guess in your brass, your brass youthful attitude, you're kind of like, yeah, that's for the old guys. Look what I can do.
Yeah.
And then I think as you get older and more, I think two things, if you get more older and more accomplished in your playing, I think a sign of your maturity in playing is you're looking for ways to embellish the melody, not the go off the deep end, you know, 100 gazillion licks within a chord structure. Um, and I think as you get older, that musicality starts starts expressing itself. And I think part of the reason too is, um, and I know this for myself, I'm 59. I turned 59 in February. I'm feeling changes in my hands. There's a natural change that happens. You know, uh, Speed is going to decrease, dexterity is going to decrease. Um, and, I asked Norman that question. It was a sensitive question to ask him, but at the point of time that we were having these recorded conversations that he allowed me to have, I felt comfortable in asking him that. And I asked him, I said, well, when did you start noticing a change from the, fire and brimstone Norman Blake, you know, playing? When did you start feeling things change and adjusting your playing? He says he was about 60, and then he said this. He says, I was about 60, and I'm paraphrasing. He says, but I had enough skills in my toolbox to make the adjustments. And I thought, wow, that's pretty profound. You
Mm.
know, it's like he just wasn't trying to play the licks. He had enough musicality and enough deep reservoir of being able to play, that he could change it to a thing where he was still Norman Blake, just a different version of Norman Blake. Um, so yeah, and I noticed that in not that I'm comparing myself to Norman, I'm not, but I'm just saying changes are going to happen. And so if you have melody, if you return to melody, and I'm telling you, sitting down and trying to play, 4 or 5 rounds of a fiddle tune, straight melody, that's 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 good practice. That's a job to do. Number one, because you tend to get bored maybe a little bit. It's just the melody. But man, all your Flat and Scruggs records are melody. All the great players like melody.
Mm.
I guess there's a reason. And so, but you're talking about the old gray mare. Norman said he got that from a banjo player named called Bull Kazee, Bullkazee, Bull Kazee, and he got that off a Folkways record called Home Sessions by Bull Kazee. So found that kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we get into down at Milo's house. What's up with
And
that?
that's the first kind of Norman's tunes on here, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, as far as his tunes, yeah. And there's a funny story about that because I was expecting it to be somebody around Sulphur Springs or Rising Fawn. I was wrong. Norman said Norman's grandfather would tell a story about a guy named Milo Steinborn, who was noted at that time as the strongest man in the world.
Mm.
And if you look up this Milo Steinborn, it's true. He's like this strongman guy in the early, I guess, early part of the century. And why Norman named it that, I, I, who knows? He says, but that's where he got it from. That's what it's about. Because his grandpa talked about it. Talked about this guy named Milo. So I guess going to Milo's house, who knows?
Brilliant. I love that.
Crazy. Yeah.
Then what do we get next? We get Sleepy Eyed Joe and Indian Creek, don't we?
Yeah, those two songs. I asked him where he got Sleepy Eye Joe. He said he got that from a guy named Ellis Hall and the Green Mountain Boys. And I had never heard of Ellis Hall. Um, but he said that uh, there's a guy named Steve Scholes who was A&R for RCA Records.
Yeah.
And Steve Scholes' grandfather was a fiddler. Um, and Steve Scholes' grandfather brought Ellis Hall to Steve's attention. And so it worked out that Steve Scholes allowed Ellis Hall to record 4 songs on it's out there somewhere. It's really rare to find. Um, but the 4 songs are Sleepy Eyed Joe, Home in West Virginia, Stony Fork, and one called Foggy Valley. And so, no surprise, Norman's got that record.
Mm.
And but he said he learned Sleepy Eyed Joe from Ellis Hall, and Indian Creek. He got that from Fiddle and Arthur Smith. He says, and it's the cut where the Delmore brothers are playing with Fiddle and Arthur Smith. And he says, look that up. He says, because Arthur Smith is wearing the Delmore brothers out, like really putting the heat to it. And of course, the Delmore brothers, that's a 6-string guitar and that's a tenor guitar. So that's a nice combination, you know. So yeah, that's where he got those 2 songs from. And again, you know, one of the things that was interesting, I guess in retrospect, I'm not surprised, but hearing him talk about where he gets some of the sources, I just really didn't expect it. And it's like, I would expect him to have grown up with those tunes, you know, much like we would grow up with, you know, whatever. Um, but he's going pretty deep on the sources for a lot of these. Arkansas Traveler, man, one of my favorite versions ever.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Just so great. Yeah, not overly fast, but man, it's just huge and says a lot. And that's just one that was common knowledge, you know. He just doesn't remember really where he got that from, you know. And the other thing I like about this record is the pace of the record. It's put together well, where you can see it's reflecting a whole listening experience. You know, you get through one side, and naturally you want to flip it over and listen to. It's all telling one complete story in some way, you know, with the pacing of it.
Yeah, and the mix of kind of instrumental stuff and vocal stuff and some older stuff and newer stuff, and you know, it is extraordinary. And I think that is you're totally right. It's one thing that is lost now. You know, this when I haven't known this record for that long, probably 3 or 4 years. And it wasn't on any of the streaming services, so I just went and bought it from Rounder's Bandcamp page, just downloaded it.
Right.
And the joy of doing that is like you listen to the whole thing all the way through, you know, rather than this. It's the funny thing, isn't it? Is the records that were recorded for vinyl have an A side and a B side, and records that were recorded like for CD are just a list of tracks. And when you know where the break comes, you can feel like something has the feel of a last track on side A and something has the feel of a side B opener, doesn't it?
There's a resolution to the last track. You just kind of go, okay. And, you know, I guess they made records like that because there was nothing. I mean, there was no other way to do it, you know, until you start getting into the horrible 8 tracks, you know, that cut off mid track. And even cassettes, I don't know what it is, but even cassettes, even if it's exactly the same songs on A and B side of a cassette, it's still not the same. And I think part of it is with records, like I said earlier, first of all, you've made the financial investment, whatever a record cost back then. And some guys get real geeky about the carrying of their records. They want leave the shrink wrap on and the dust jacket. Um, they put a dust jacket on it, and you clean it real well, and you go through this. And I do it too. I mean, I during COVID, I went uh, online and I bought all of my favorite records that I didn't take care of when I was a young idiot.
Mm.
Um, and again, when Tony died, trying to find a copy of Manzanita for a reasonable price was, but I found one, and I'm always wanting the mint or as close as I can get to that. Um, my wife got me a really nice turntable, and I go through this process of taking the record out, cleaning it, cleaning it again, cleaning the needle, putting the weight in the center on the spindle. And it's this ritual that you go through just to get to the first track, you know. And I think part of the beautiful mystery of vinyl is precisely that. It's a discipline to listen to the record. It's intentional listening. You can go on your iPhone now and say, well, I want to listen to whatever and find it in a matter of seconds. But back in the day, you had to decide, I'm in the mood for this. And you had to go to your record collection and find it.
Mhm.
And then this ritual of preparing to play it. Of course, now some people just put it on and let it go. But there is something, you're invested in the process of it and then listening experience. And I think that makes the reward of the listening experience even greater, because then you have to get up and switch sides and commit to the other side, maybe. Um, and it's interesting the mentality of how people make records these days. It's interesting that you said it's a list of tracks now, and and that is true. I mean, to a large degree. Um, Radio puts out singles now. It's a single driven thing. I have plenty of friends with label deals, uh, myself included, with Billy Blue, that they'll put out singles and then they'll put the record out at a later time and maybe not put any more singles out because everybody's got the record. And unfortunately, you know, nobody's really buying records anymore, even online. How many people own the music on their Apple Music?
Mhm.
Like, I downloaded the CD and paid 9.95 for it. So the mentality of listening has really changed. And again, I think this with vinyl reflects a slower time, you know, uh, and now it's making the resurgence, I guess. People maybe are finding the value in taking your time with vinyl. But I like it. And I tell you what, if you've got a great receiver and a great pre, and you've got a really good set of speakers or a really good set of headphones, man, vinyl sounds different. It just really does. There's an analog warmth and body to it and spirit to it that you just don't get on CD. And that's the truth. And I kind of like, even with vinyl, this even on the best quality vinyl, you still have a little of that sound, you know, that
Mhm.
noise that's in the vinyl just because of what it is. And maybe I'm kind of a hopeless vinyl romantic, but I
Mhm.
find that really kind of charming in its own way. Maybe it takes you back to a younger time,
Yeah,
a
I
place you can't visit
think it
again.
depends what you grew up with, doesn't it? I think it's so much of this stuff. It's like I still have loads of stuff on my iTunes that was CDs that I bought and then I downloaded. I still have all this music sat in a shoebox size hard drive that like can't get rid of it. But
Yeah,
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 and like so,
yeah.
like with the A side B side thing, we're firmly into side two of this record. We've had our Traveller, and we've got Girl I Left in Sunny Tennessee next up.
Oh, yeah. Well, um, the it so it was, and I think he's got it listed. The girl I left behind me. Oh no, the girl I left in Sunny Tennessee. Yeah. Um, it's also called "The Girl I Left Behind Me," but he got that actually from Charlie Poole. Is who he got it from. Charlie Poole and the North Carolina Ramblers. They actually cut that song in 1925. And amazingly, that song by Charlie Poole sold 65,000 copies in 1925.
So that's a 100-year-old song.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a 100-year-old recording um, that sold 65,000 in 1925. That's big.
Mm.
That's a lot, you know. It was written in 1899 by Harry, I think it was Harry Breasted and Stanley Carter. And what's interesting is that uh, if you listen to the Charlie Poole version in the chorus, the term darkies, the term darkies for African American people is used in the choruses, and Norman opted not to do that. But it just that for Charlie Poole, that was the time, but offensive term today, obviously, but freely used in the South during that time, and Charlie Poole's audience probably wouldn't have thought anything of that. Um, but yeah, so Norman, he and I respect him for that. He opted to not use that, even in 1976. Which he could have stood on the soapbox and go, "Yeah, I'm keeping it authentic the way it was originally written," but he didn't. And I appreciate that for him.
Mm.
Yeah, so and there's a lot of versions of this song out there, you know. But yeah, Charlie Poole had the original cut on it in 25, and I'd kind of like to wonder with the demographic of people and the buying public in 1925, like who had record players? How many people, in any given city had record players in 1920? That's like, what would 65,000 copies equate to a popular artist today?
Yeah.
Is that a half a million? Is that, I mean, who knows? But he seems to have been a pretty popular artist. Uh, huh. So yeah, that's where you got that one from.
And then we get The Minstrel Boy to the War Has Gone and The Ash Grove.
Yeah. Ashgrove, he didn't give me anything on that, but The Minstrel Boy, it's just an old Irish song written by Thomas Moore in the early 1800s. He does two verses, but there was actually a third verse written for it right after the Civil War. But he includes the two verses. Well, of course, he doesn't sing. I mean, it's an instrumental.
Mm.
But for the singers, there's only two verses of it, unless you include the one written after the Civil War, which kind of would make sense that they would use that song and the subject matter, for something like the Great War. Um, yeah. And what's interesting about Norman, whether it's like this kind of guitar playing or Salt River or whatever, it's kind of a chameleon on his playing because it's like different styles,
Yeah.
and you'll even hear him um, uh, uh, on some of these songs. Well, we're going to get to one. We just have to see on the A side, which one is it? Six White Horses. Yeah, he's playing with thumb pick and picks, and so slanky, man. I mean,
Yeah.
just yeah, real greasy, real relaxed, real slanky. And so he's changing kind of like a chameleon with all these different kind of guitar styles, but it's the same thing. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
and Nancy calls it out in the liner notes, doesn't she? She talks about him playing with picks, flat picking and bare
Yeah.
fingers, and other different sort of textures. It's all one guitar. It's all the same string gauges. It's all the same thing, but he's using all sorts of things to get the sound out of that.
And here's what's also interesting. Well, and I would offer this up. Here's a good bet that you'll always win. Find somebody in bluegrass using a Fender medium tri-cornered pick.
With one of the corners rounded off, it says.
with one of their corners rounded off. Yeah. And and I think what's interesting about that, if you and I haven't seen them in years, but I remember them. They there was a triangle guitar pick. Fender made them, and and I'm trying to think. Okay, so you got this really triangular pick with one corner rounded off, whatever that means for whenever he's going to use it. But you can kind of hear how that thinner tri-corner sharp edge pick. I mean, what they were probably inch and a half by an inch and a half. I mean, it's not a small pick.
Yeah,
You can kind of hear how it brings out that high end on that guitar. You know,
it's really
it has
interesting.
a sparkle to it, a little more character to the high end, and everything.
When you think
You
about Hand
know,
Me Down My Walking Cane and the track we're going to get to next, Church Street Blues, Church Street Blues. There's almost like it's almost like a zither auto harp quality to the high end. And it's
yes,
fascinating
sir.
reading that about the pick because the string gauges are certainly not thin strings, and it's not like a quiet tinny guitar, and yet he still gets this
No,
sparkle out of it as well.
and I wonder, like, um, it's a bar fret 34 D18, which would not that there's a lot of them out there because there's not, um, but I would tend to think that that guitar would have a more tubbier may not be the right adjective to use, but maybe a little darker sound.
Well, and with the wider
Because like
string
the
spacing
30,
too.
right, you know, um, the 34 18s and 28s, they're a little dark. They have a darker sound than their 35, 36 contemporaries. And so maybe he recognized that and maybe it just popped to the microphone a little bit better. Another thing to kind of consider too is, um, and it's worthy to ask him, down the line. But like when he's doing the Johnny Cash show, or he's playing backup for Cash or Christofferson or any of those people, where he's in that rhythm mode, that he's not doing any lead playing or anything. He's playing their songs, commercial songs. And I know it from my own job with McGraw. It's like when I flat pick or do, I use different kinds of blue chip picks, and they're heavy 45s, 50s, 55s, with rounded corners. But like when I'm on the road doing rhythm for Tim, I'm just using a celluloid teardrop medium because it gives me that sparkle, and it's disposable. Um, you don't want to lose the $35 blue chip on stage somewhere and out there. But it gives you that sound. It gives you that rhythm sound that really adds that. And I wonder if Norman like took that element of it from doing the side gigs with Christofferson and Cash and said, "Hey, you know what? I'm just going to stick with this pick because I'm used to using it, and I'm just going to apply it to what I do."
But it's,
Maybe I don't
I
know.
think what you said is really true. Is that I've seen a video of Bryan Sutton in his studio, and he's got a music stand, and he's just got a pile of picks on it, and he says
Yeah,
picks are basically EQ.
they are. They really are. And he's really right. I mean, when I do sessions myself, I take a ton of different things, and you're wanting to find the pick that kind of fits the song, that fits the guitar.
Mm.
It's like the old thing of people say, "Well, what's the best guitar to use in the studio?" Well, the one that fits the song. And sometimes that could be a really cheap guitar. I've on the Dance Hall Doctors records. I remember using a cheap $300 Takamine for some, or excuse me, Alvarez Yari, um, because it had a real specific sound. It wasn't a big sounding guitar. It didn't have a lot of tone to it, but for that track, it really fit. I remember using it for that reason. And Brian's right. Yeah. Picture EQ. Um, and so I think Norman maybe the intent that he puts forth on the record sonically kind of hints to he's using that pick for a reason. That's really an unusual pick to use for flat picking. Um, and today he doesn't use that. He's for years he's always used something a little heavier. He does the thing with Apollo picks. You know, um, and they're basically pretty much round. For like look at Kenny Smith's signature pick from Blue Chip. It's round and small. It's like the size of a nickel. I don't even know how he holds on to
Mm.
it, but he does. But it gives him a particular tone and a particular sound. Um, and I do know for a fact that Norman, when he plays mandolin, he likes that rounded sound, rounded edge better. So maybe over time, since he was doing almost as much mandolin work at times as guitar, it made sense to stick with the more rounder pick as time went on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and there's not really a track on this record that sort of exemplifies that sparkly tone more than Church Street Blues, which is next up, and it's just got such a
Oh,
zing to it. And for people who are so used to Tony's version, like it's a totally different. It's a totally different. I mean, they're so connected. It's the same song. It's the same thing, but they're two very different approaches to the same song, aren't
yeah, I think, at the risk of being bragging about it, I'm not bragging about it, but Vince Gill, on my Norman tribute album, I got Vince to sing Church Street
they?
Blues. And originally, um, I was wanting to do it as a slower blues song, like slower. And I was talking to Derek Trucks to get to play slide on it, which didn't work out because when Vince came in, Vince had a different vision for it, which is totally different than Tony's version and of course, the original. But you're right. The Tony version, it's had Norman never wrote that song and you never had any previous versions, that would have been the standard. That would have been like if it was a new song,
Mm.
that Tony just recorded. Uh, um, and and I like the fact that the version we have of Tony is just him and guitar. I like that. There's something really special about that. But Norman's version, yeah, he's capoed up. It's in a totally different key. There's a different energy about it. There's that sparkly dancing quality. It's a lighthearted quality thing. Um, I had asked him about this before, but he reiterated. Um, he wrote it during his time in Nashville, and he says it's perhaps a little reflection on his homesickness for Rising Fawn. Kind of trapped in Nashville. Uh, I don't think he liked Nashville very much. I think he was here um, because George Gruen helped bring him here. There's a whole story behind that. Uh, George Gruen and Tut Taylor had brought Norman to town to teach guitar. Imagine taking guitar classes from Norman
Mm.
Blake,
Wow.
right? But he soon got work, real quick. Um, did the Dylan record, huge. And then got in with Johnny Cash, and did all of the Cash shows. Um, and was his band leader for a while. And Norman told me, he says, they had on the Cash show, they had the orchestra down front at the Ryman and had Cash's band. He says he was the one that could best communicate musically between Cash's musicians and then the orchestra. So I guess he's not saying it, but I guess he had such a high level of musicianship that even not reading music, he was a good intermediary between the two,
Mm.
you know. Um, and so during that time it's like when all of these songs are popping up, he's writing stuff like Church Street Blues, or Slow Train to Georgia or whatever. During this time he's like doing all this big work with these big Nashville acts. And I think I have a feeling his hands left Rising Fawn, but his heart never did.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I mean, this song certainly has that in it, and I guess Nashville is one of those places that if you need the work, you need to be there, but doesn't make it the place you want to be, does it?
I think Nashville. I, s- I I say this as an old guy who's not as established as some others in town, but I've been here for 32, 33 years. I'm fortunate to be a working musician, you know. But I will say this: it's a young guy's town, a young girls' town. It's you you come here if you come here young and can work, that's a great thing, you know. But like any other commodity, music is always looking for younger, you know, and younger naturally finds its way into it. You know, the old guys usually become, you know, A&R guys or record producers or,
Mm.
you know, or used car salesmen, who knows what. But there's a time when your number's up, you know. Um, and I think it was just the same way back then with no, and also too with the time that this record was recorded in Nashville. Um, that hippie movement was kind of a new thing for Nashville. You know, it had the old guard. I'd asked Norman about that. I asked him. I said, "Well, how did Acuff, you know, who was like he's the godfather of the Opry, you know, uh, how did Roy Acuff and Bill Monroe and them feel about all you hippies coming into town and kind of just bringing something different to the music scene?" And he told me, he says, "Well, he says Acuff didn't like it." He says, but he knew that there was enough good music around that it was okay to kind of let him stay. He says Monroe, kind of the same way. He says, but Monroe used him on some recordings. You know, back in the early '80s, Monroe cut 4 songs with Norman playing guitar.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Um, oh yeah, one of them, I forget the names of them, but the most prominent one is "My Last Days on Earth."
I didn't know that was Norman.
Oh yeah, and so what's interesting is it was Norman. The bass player's name escapes me. I should know that, um, but it was Norman, the bass player, and Monroe. And Norman said we went to the studio, and what was funny about it is that they had a microphone for Norman, and they had a microphone also for Monroe's mandolin, but they also took a lavalier mic and dropped that in the F hole of the mandolin, which he found kind of odd,
Yeah.
you know. Um, and then they recorded the track, and Walter Haynes, I think, was the producer engineer. And Norman says Walter. Uh, Monroe speaks up on the talk back and says, "Walter, how's that sound?" Of course, you got to talk like Monroe, you know. Walter, how's that sound? He says, "It sounds like money to me, Uncle Bill." And from that point on, Norman and Nancy always referred to Monroe as Uncle Bill, which I found endearing, you know.
Yeah.
But Norman recorded, so you know, Monroe didn't mind it too much. In fact, there's a famous recording. Uh, Norman says I was at the exit in, or not the exit in, but the picking parlor one time, and Monroe just comes in, you know, to hang out, and they're trying to get him on stage to play some. Of course, he carried his mandolin everywhere because maybe he wanted people to ask, you know.
Mm.
And they said, he says, you know, our eyes met, you know, but no, he's not really paying attention to me. And these people are saying, "Hey, Bill, would you get up and play a few?" And he says, I will if Norman will back me up." So he liked Norman's playing,
Yeah.
you know. And I think one of the reasons he liked Norman's playing is Norman probably reminded him of Charlie with his rhythm style. Because if you listen to the early Monroe Brothers stuff and listen to Charlie Monroe's guitar, you can kind of see where that's an influence on Norman. And I asked Norman, I said, like, as a keynote to Charlie, I said, Norman, what, me and Kenny Smith were down at Norman's, and I said, like the guitars you had in Nashville when you came to Nashville. I said, what'd you have when you came to Nashville? He says, oh, I had Charlie Monroe's D45. Wow.
Yeah.
So for him to have Charlie Monroe's D45, raised partly on those Monroe Brothers recordings, it kind of makes sense why Bill would favor his playing.
Mm.
A good backup guitar player, played proper, And so, yeah, but Church Street Blues, and I think the great thing about Church Street Blues with any of Norman's songs that he wrote, I think the testament of a great song lyrically is the fact that it can be changed so many different ways and still retain its character and its essence and its lyrical greatness.
Mm.
And Church Street Blues, I mean, if you listen to the Punch Brothers do their version, wow,
Yeah.
I mean, totally different from what we've been talking about, and yet still great. And probably years down the line, there'll be other people, uh, doing it in a different way, and it'll still be great. But my hope, and this was kind of my hope a few years ago with my tribute album, I hope younger players go back, like using the Tony template. They may know Tony's Church Street Blues, but I hope they go back when they hear these songs and go back and listen to Norman's versions, to the guy who wrote them,
Mm.
and kind of see what that's all about, you know. Um, and then we get into another original, Making Rag, on the record. Uh, again, finger picks, and man, the way he plays that is just so greasy and so slanky and just I don't know how to put it. It's just in the pocket. It's great. And you hear one of my favorite parts about it is you hear the picks kind of hit the top of the guitar, his fingernails hit the pick guard on one of the sections, and they leave it, which is great,
Yeah.
But I knew he had obviously had written it. Um, but something that is on the interviews, or not interviews, but I always call them interviews, and I shouldn't. They're conversations that I had with Norman is, he's always had and I asked him about this song in particular. He's always had a romance. Um, and I don't think he would mind me saying this, but like this romantic thing of making a living on the streets of some town in the South, like back in the 20s and 30s with a guitar. The romanticism of that, the time, just being a street musician, making your daily bread by playing on the street. And he talks about that, in this conversation I had with him. And it's not the first rag he wrote. He's got tons of other Savannah Rag, all these other rags. But I think they're all kind of connected with this idea that he had in his head of another place, another time, and him making a living as a street musician, which I find interesting.
Well,
It's kind of, yeah,
Church Street Blues like fits that narrative as well, doesn't it? As a song
it
about.
really does.
And then and we talked about sort of tracks on this record that are completely iconic, and then we get to Fiddler's Jam and Whiskey for Breakfast, and
Yeah,
here's another one.
right. My naivety, you know, I I asked Norman, I said, "What, you probably just grew up with these tunes around He says, "Oh no." He says, "No, they're later additions." Um, so Fiddler's Dram, he got that from Doc Watson, and that's on an early Doc Watson record. I don't remember which one. I should have had it prepared for this, but I did. But um, the version that Doc did is where he got it from. He got Fiddler's Dram from that, and then Whiskey Before Breakfast. he got that from Howdy Forster, the famous fiddle player Howdy Forster, who also played with Acuff. Um, and so, really, two fiddle tunes that are kind because Howdy wrote that song, "Whiskey Before Breakfast." Two fiddle tunes that sound really archaic,
Mm.
and you would expect him to have picked them up when he was a teenager, and he didn't get to them until later with Doc and Howdy Forster. And it's really weird how those two tunes. I mean, now you almost play them together because Norman did. They fit. It's like they're one song now. They're two separate things, but they're one thing
Mm.
all together. Um, and Norman also reiterates too with the course of Whiskey Before Breakfast, the second part. Uh, he has some chord changes, and I might do a little YouTube video on this. He has some chord changes that he thinks makes it more, as he says, fiddly, more, and he says it sounds more like the French Canadian fiddle players. And so, and he was playing it on mandolin, and I'm playing on guitar. He's giving me these chord changes, and they're nothing big. I mean, because you only got so much to work with. But the chord changes makes it sound a little bit more like a fiddle player song, because we always hang on the one, da 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 da. You go to the five. He's got a whole different set of chords that he uses within those bars or those measures to kind of give it a different thing. And again, reiterating, that's how the song goes today. Tomorrow might just be totally different,
Yeah.
which I think is a great thing. Um, we often get stuck as guitar players in the rut of doing something the same way. It's like there's no rules for that. Let's kind of break that mold. And again, I think that's the thing. If you're learning fiddle tunes, yeah, find different keys to play them in. It's like if you're going to play Whiskey Before Breakfast, typically everybody plays it capoed on the second fret out of the C position, and that's D. Try playing it with try playing it open with your E string tuned down to a D, and playing it in an open position, well, out of a D position.
Mm.
Try that. So, and I think that exploration, I think really one of the things that you can walk away with this record is that sense of exploration that he brings forth on the record, interpreting these tunes in his own way and not being afraid to do it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So that's Fiddler's Dram and Whiskey Before Breakfast, and then to your point on how to end a record, you get to Slow Train Through Georgia, and wow, what's your favorite part about that song?
I mean, it's hard to pick apart really because it's one of those that like, you could easily end this record on Fiddler's Jam Whiskey Before Breakfast, and that would
Yeah, you
be
could.
a great ending. And like this, it
Yeah,
almost feels like a bonus. Do you know what I mean? It's like it's giving you everything
yeah,
it could give you, and then there's this. Do you know what I mean?
yeah, yeah. Um, it's very somber, and it's very there's somber melancholy there. And I asked him this on the conversation. I asked him about these tunes for this interview. He goes, man, he says it's probably just a metaphor for wanting to get out of the show business and national scene. And so there's another song that he's kind of reiterating. I kind of want out of this town, you know. And like I said, his hands came to Nashville, but I think his heart always stayed in Rising Fawn, you know. And it's interesting, you listen to those songs, um, and if you ever had the opportunity to go visit them, first of all, you got to find the house. That's the other half of it, you know. He told me, he says, when you see a certain thing turn into the bushes, he wasn't kidding, man. It's like Bat Cave, and And he's just, he's content to have lived in that area, and he'll die in that area. And it's like his buddy Joe McCormick says, which I agree, when he's gone, it's gone. And whatever that it is. And I think, this album is a big part of that it that drew a lot of people to him. So Slow Train Through Georgia is kind of that, like he says, it's that metaphor for just wanting to kind of get out of the show business aspect of it, and move to a place that he's always known that is still slow paced. He has a neighbor, uh, that there's a picture of him talking to this old man in a wheelchair, and Norman, he's hunched over because he's got his cane, and he's got his hat on and everything, and his overalls and the suit jacket. Um, and that was at this old man's birthday party. And I asked Norman, before I hung up, I said, "Hey, I said, is your neighbor okay? Is he still alive?" He says, "No, he only made it to 102."
Hmm.
And I thought that was funny that he only made it to 102. And my point being, the pace is so slow where they live. Like I said, they don't have heating, and they don't have air conditioning. They have wall heaters or space heaters. There's no internet. There's no cell phone. There's no cable TV. Um, Nancy makes her coffee out of a metal percolator on a gas stove. And so Ginger does that here too. Best cup of coffee you'll ever have. Um, and they just live in a different existence. And I think these records, it's like if you want to know who he is, delve into these records, because whether you start with the first record or the very last record, there's everything you need to know about Norman and Nancy. They're in those records. They're in the grooves. You just have to sit and dedicate yourself to listening to them. And I think it's best found in the grooves of vinyl. You know, those records, every record, because it's so all of their records are so earthy and woody with the instruments and the spirit of them. It's like it's kind of blasphemous to listen to them on anything else but vinyl. But sometimes you don't have an option. So,
Yeah, well, no, and it is. I think that's true. If ever there's an artist where you need to get a sense of who they are, put their music on, this is it. And like, it's been
yeah.
a treat talking to you about this record, and thank you for being a bridge between that world and ours, so we can get some insight into that. Because, like you say, when Norman is gone, he will be gone, and that's a huge loss. And so to have just a bit of an insight into that is a beautiful thing.
I appreciate that. And I want to clarify to people, it's not like, it's not like I'm, best friends with Norman or anything like that, or calling him every week. I'm not, there's been spans of months that go by that I don't bother him. Um, for whatever reason, um, they were very generous to give me a year of time to visit and get to know them to a degree, um, and record some conversations. Like I say, our deal is when Norman he says, when he passes, I can let these out into the world. And I'm not excited for him to pass, but I am excited for the world to hear some of these things in his own voice, Um, but in my estimation, he's the last Mohican. He's the last guy standing. He's outlived all of his contemporaries on the Circle album, except for the guys in the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. Um, and he just turned 87, and he's just as sharp as a tack. I would be curious to hear how he plays. I wish he'd give us one more record, and all I'm going to say is I'm trying to make something happen. I don't know if let me just say, in the spirit of it takes a village to raise a child. It might take a big village to make this happen. But I think if we can make it happen, he's got a lot of stuff still yet to say. Even if he's, you hear the hands like on the last couple records, you hear the hand fingernails hit the guitar. I mean, he's 87 years old, you know, and he still plays guitar better than anybody else I know, at 67, right? So, um, but it's an honor to be a caretaker of these conversations and to from being a 12-year-old boy who picked up this record and a cheap guitar at Boot Hill Records in Missouri, to a guy now who's approaching 60. Uh, I feel very honored to have had some time with, rightly said, he's an American treasure. Him and Nancy both. I have to include both of them because they both are. But I appreciate the kind words, and man, as always, man, I enjoy the conversations with you, and thank you for putting in the time and the effort to record conversations with people, that this stuff will be valuable to listeners years and years down the line. I'm really glad you're doing this. This is worthwhile.
Thank
You
you.
know, accomplished players and their perspective on their favorite music or whatever the subject might be that you do. It's appreciated.
Thank you. I hope these, I mean, that's part of the joy of doing. I love doing this, obviously, but the idea that conversations will be around for people to get something from in years to come is something I definitely hope will be the case. Thanks, Bob. It is
Yeah.
always a joy talking to you.
Thank you so much, Matt. You be safe, my friend. We'll talk again soon.
Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas.